first time Kale saw her, he knew something was different. The market was bustling with alien life forms. Six-legged reptilians, floating jellyfish-like traders, and towering, insectoid diplomats. But in the chaos, she stood still. Her skin shimmered like liquid metal, her delicate features unreadable, and her eyes, two silver pools of light, glowed with an eerie intensity. Every being that crossed her gaze stopped in their tracks, their bodies rigid, their minds seemingly lost in the endless depths of her stare. Kale had heard of mind control species before. Certain telepathic creatures from the Andromeda sector could overwhelm weaker minds. Some parasitic entities took control of their hosts through spores. But this was something else. These aliens weren't fighting back, weren't even resisting. They simply stood there, transfixed. And yet Kale felt nothing. He watched, fascinated, as more and more beings fell under her silent thrall. A merchant slug, its many eyes blinking in confusion, dropped its wares. A trio of sentient avians fluttered their wings before freezing mid-motion. Even the security drones, programmed with anti-psychic shielding, fizzled and deactivated the moment her gaze touched them. Kale stepped closer. She turned to him. Those silver eyes locked onto his, and he braced himself for some unseen force to take hold. But nothing happened. He could still hear the murmurs of the market, the hum of ships overhead, the crackle of an energy fence nearby. His thoughts remained his own. Her expression shifted just slightly, a flicker of something like surprise. "You're human." Her voice was a whisper, barely audible. Kale blinked. That wasn't a language he knew, but somehow he understood her. He nodded. "And you are?" She hesitated. "Zyra." The name meant nothing to him, but something in the way she said it made him believe she had not spoken it aloud in a long time. He looked around. The market had gone silent. Dozens of beings stood frozen in place, lost in the abyss of her gaze. "You need to let them go." She exhaled sharply, and in an instant, the spell broke. The alien crowd gasped collectively, shaking off the trance as though waking from a deep sleep. Some staggered, others cried out in confusion, but most simply looked around, disoriented. No one seemed to know what had happened. Zyra took a step back. "You resist me." Kale crossed his arms. "Seems that way. Why?" She shook her head. "I don't know." There was something in her voice, a tremor of uncertainty, of fear. "You didn't mean to do that, did you?" he asked. She flinched, her silver gaze flickering downward. "No. It happens whenever I make eye contact. I cannot control it." Kale studied her. She was alone.
No escorts, no guards.
A being with the power to enthrall an entire room, wandering unprotected? It didn't add up. Someone must be looking for you. Her eyes snapped up to meet his, but this time, the glow dimmed. They were, but they gave up. Kale had been around the galaxy long enough to recognize the weight of unspoken things. There was a story here, one soaked in loneliness. "Come with me," he said before he even realized what he was offering. Zyra hesitated. "Why?" "Because I think you need help, and I have a feeling you don't get many people offering that." For a long moment, she simply stared at him, unreadable. Then slowly she nodded. Kale wasn't sure what he was getting himself into, but as they moved through the bustling market together, he noticed something. For the first time since he had seen her, she didn't avoid looking at anyone, and for the first time her eyes did not glow. They navigated through the winding streets of the market, weaving between towering metallic structures and pulsating neon signs. The air smelled of foreign spices and mechanical oil, and Kale kept his pace steady, ensuring Zyra stayed close. She walked carefully, as if every step was a decision. "Where are we going?" she asked finally. "I've got a ship docked nearby," he said. "Figured you might need a place to lay low." Zyra glanced at him, her silver eyes flickering faintly. "You trust me?" Kale smirked. "Not really, but I've got a feeling about you." She didn't respond. Instead, she seemed to be processing his words as though they were foreign. Maybe, to her, they were. They reached the docking bay, a massive open space filled with various starships, some sleek and new, others rusted and barely holding together. Kale led her toward a compact, well-worn vessel with reinforced plating and an old but reliable hyperdrive. "This is it," he said, pressing a sequence on the control panel. The hatch hissed open. Zyra hesitated at the threshold. "What if I can't control it?" Kale leaned against the frame. "Then we figure it out." After a long pause, she stepped inside. As the hatch sealed behind them, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something far bigger than he had anticipated.